Merchants of Doubt: How a Handful of Scientists Obscured the Truth on Issues from Tobacco Smoke to Climate Change. Introduction. Unveiling the Merchants of Doubt. Merchants of doubt, individuals or organizations sowing confusion about scientific findings, stand at the crossroads of fact and fiction, where agendas eclipse evidence. Their modus operandi is deceptively simple, yet profoundly impactful. They manufacture uncertainty around well-established scientific conclusions to delay or derail regulation. The tactics pioneered by the tobacco industry in the mid-20th century set the stage for a series of orchestrated campaigns aimed at discrediting science, from the dangers of smoking to the realities of climate change. In Merchants of Doubt, science historians Naomi Oreskes and Erik Conway unveil the mechanisms through which these campaigns operate. They detail the players, often self-proclaimed defenders of free market ideology, and the methods they use to exploit public misunderstandings of science and its inherent uncertainties. Science, by nature, is iterative and self-correcting, which means that it seldom delivers absolute truths. It is within this space of evolving understanding that doubt-mongers thrive, magnifying uncertainty to erode public trust and stall progress. The book traverses multiple domains of scientific inquiry to illustrate this pattern. It examines the battle over the harmful effects of tobacco and secondhand smoke, the feasibility of nuclear defense systems and the specter of nuclear winter, the environmental crises of acid rain and the ozone hole, and the enduring debate on climate change. Each case reveals a consistent playbook: the distortion of facts, the vilification of scientific institutions, and the manipulation of public opinion through strategic misinformation. Central to this narrative is the alignment of doubt-mongering with free market fundamentalism. Many of the merchants of doubt are fervent believers in unregulated capitalism, viewing any form of government intervention as a threat to personal and economic freedoms. Yet, this ideological commitment often blinds them to the market's failures, particularly when it comes to environmental degradation and public health crises. By portraying scientific warnings as overreactions or conspiracies, they seek to preserve the status quo, even at the expense of long-term societal well-being. Oreskes and Conway not only expose these tactics but also offer tools for discerning fact from fabrication. In an era of abundant information and rampant disinformation, critical thinking becomes a crucial defense against the merchants of doubt. The authors emphasize the importance of understanding the scientific method, recognizing the consensus within scientific communities, and questioning the motives of those who challenge established evidence. This book serves as a cautionary tale and a call to action. By tracing the historical roots of doubt-mongering and its contemporary manifestations, it challenges us to consider the ethical dimensions of science, politics, and communication. Are we willing to let vested interests dictate public discourse, or will we demand accountability and transparency in the face of manufactured uncertainty? As we dive into the following chapters, the merchants of doubt will emerge not as abstract villains, but as tangible actors in a battle for truth. Their strategies and successes illuminate a sobering reality: in the war against misinformation, science alone is not enough. It must be paired with vigilance, education, and a collective commitment to evidence-based decision-making. Chapter 1. The Architects of Doubt: How Uncertainty Becomes a Weapon. Science, at its core, seeks to uncover truths about the natural world through careful observation, experimentation, and refinement of ideas. Yet, the very nature of science, its reliance on uncertainty and its iterative approach, makes it vulnerable to exploitation. This chapter unpacks how merchants of doubt have weaponized uncertainty to confuse the public, delay regulation, and protect powerful interests. The nature of scientific uncertainty. Science thrives on uncertainty. Questions, rather than answers, propel scientific inquiry, driving researchers to refine hypotheses and uncover new insights. While this process strengthens scientific knowledge, it can be misinterpreted by those unfamiliar with how science works. For the public, scientific uncertainty is often conflated with unreliability, a misconception that merchants of doubt deliberately exploit. By amplifying minor gaps in understanding or disagreements among scientists, they create an illusion of wholesale scientific controversy, even when overwhelming consensus exists. For instance, when the first studies linked smoking to lung cancer, scientists openly discuss variables and methodological improvements for future research, a standard practice in the scientific community. However, tobacco industry representatives seized on this openness to claim that the science was unsettled. This distortion of the scientific process became a cornerstone of doubt-mongering campaigns across various issues. The merchants of doubt: who are they? The individuals and organizations behind these campaigns often present themselves as defenders of free markets, personal liberties, or even scientific integrity. Many are economists, scientists, or policy experts with ties to corporate interests or conservative think tanks. Their opposition to regulation stems from a staunch belief in market supremacy and a distrust of government intervention. One archetype of the merchant of doubt is the free market fundamentalist. This group views any form of regulation as an affront to economic freedom and an overreach of governmental power. Their ideology blinds them to the systemic failures of unregulated markets, particularly in addressing environmental degradation or public health risks. Markets often fail to account for externalities, unintended consequences such as pollution or health crises that do not reflect the true cost of goods or services. Free market fundamentalists, however, resist acknowledging these failures, fearing that doing so might legitimize government intervention. Another archetype is the hired gun, scientists, consultants, or public relations experts who lend credibility to doubt-mongering efforts. Many were recruited by industries facing regulation, such as tobacco, fossil fuels, and chemicals. Their role is to produce reports, testify at hearings, or appear in the media to downplay risks and question the validity of scientific findings. Often, these individuals rely on selective data, flawed methodologies, or outright falsehoods to support their claims. The playbook of doubt. Doubt-mongering campaigns follow a consistent playbook, refined over decades. 1. Magnify uncertainty. Highlight minor scientific disagreements or limitations to suggest that the entire field is unreliable. 2. Attack the messenger. Discredit scientists, research institutions, or regulatory agencies by accusing them of bias, incompetence, or ulterior motives. 3. Create false balance. Present fringe opinions as equivalent to the scientific consensus, giving the impression of an evenly split debate. 4. Delay action. Call for more research or insist on absolute certainty before implementing policies, even when the evidence already supports action. 5. Deflect blame. Shift attention away from systemic problems by emphasizing individual responsibility or unrelated factors. Why it works. The success of doubt-mongering hinges on two critical factors: public misunderstanding of science and the media's need for controversy. For many, the scientific method's iterative nature is indistinguishable from indecision. Merchants of doubt exploit this by framing evolving science as evidence of its unreliability. The media, meanwhile, often seeks to present both sides of an issue for the sake of balance. While this approach is laudable in political discourse, it can be misleading in scientific contexts where one side represents overwhelming consensus and the other is an outlier. Merchants of doubt capitalize on this by positioning themselves as the underdog in a supposed David and Goliath battle against mainstream science. The stakes. The implications of doubt-mongering are profound. When the public doubts scientific evidence, policymakers are less likely to act decisively. This delay can have catastrophic consequences, from worsening public health crises to irreversible environmental damage. By examining the roots of these campaigns and the strategies employed, we can begin to recognize and counteract the merchants of doubt. As we proceed, the subsequent chapters will delve into specific case studies, illustrating how these tactics have played out across issues ranging from tobacco to climate change. Each case demonstrates the far-reaching consequences of manufacturing doubt and the urgent need to defend scientific integrity. Chapter 2: Tobacco and the Birth of Doubt-Mongering. The story of doubt-mongering begins with the tobacco industry, whose efforts to obscure the dangers of smoking laid the foundation for a playbook used by merchants of doubt in subsequent decades. By leveraging public relations strategies, cherry-picking data, and attacking scientific findings, the industry delayed regulation and saved billions of dollars at the expense of public health. This chapter examines how the tobacco industry manufactured doubt and explores the far-reaching implications of its actions. The discovery of tobacco's risks. By the mid-20th century, scientific evidence linking smoking to severe health risks had become compelling. Early warning signs emerged as far back as the 1930s, when German scientists identified a correlation between cigarette smoking and lung cancer. However, these findings were largely dismissed due to their association with Nazi-era research. The turning point came in the 1950s when researchers at the Sloan Kettering Institute conducted experiments showing that cigarette tar caused cancer in laboratory mice. These findings, along with large-scale epidemiological studies, revealed a strong causal link between smoking and lung cancer. The public began to take notice, and fears over the health consequences of smoking grew. The tobacco industry responds. Faced with mounting evidence, the tobacco industry embarked on a campaign to sow doubt about the health risks of smoking. In 1953, tobacco executives met with the public relations firm Hill and Knowlton to develop a strategy to counteract the negative publicity. This meeting marked the birth of systematic doubt-mongering. Their plan hinged on a simple yet powerful idea. If the public could be convinced that the science was unsettled, they would continue to smoke. The industry established the Tobacco Industry Research Committee, TIRC, ostensibly to fund unbiased research. In reality, the TIRC was a front for manufacturing doubt. It produced studies designed to obscure the dangers of smoking and amplify uncertainty, creating the illusion of a scientific debate where none existed. Tactics of doubt. The tobacco industry employed several key tactics that became hallmarks of doubt-mongering campaigns. 1. Sponsoring favorable research. The TIRC funded studies that minimized the risks of smoking or focused on unrelated causes of lung cancer, such as pollution or genetic predisposition. 2. Attacking detractors. Scientists who published findings on the dangers of smoking were discredited as biased or incompetent. The industry accused researchers and public health advocates of waging ideological wars rather than pursuing objective science. 3. Misleading messaging. The industry launched advertising campaigns claiming that more research was needed before conclusions about smoking's risks could be drawn. This messaging framed the tobacco companies as responsible actors who valued scientific integrity. 4. Delaying regulation. By fostering the perception that the science was unsettled, the industry stalled legislative efforts to regulate tobacco products, such as requiring warning labels or restricting advertising. The legacy of Fred Zeitz. One of the most influential figures in the tobacco industry's campaign was physicist Fred Zeitz, a former president of the National Academy of Sciences. Zeitz lent his scientific credentials to the industry's cause, directing funding to researchers who questioned the risks of smoking. While his expertise lay far from the field of public health, his reputation as a respected scientist lent credibility to the industry's claims. Zeitz's involvement with the tobacco industry marked a troubling precedent. Scientists could be co-opted to serve corporate interests, using their authority to undermine legitimate research. Zeitz and others like him would later apply these same tactics to other issues, including climate change and environmental regulation. The cost of doubt. The tobacco industry's campaign of disinformation had devastating consequences. It took decades for the public to widely accept the dangers of smoking, and during that time, millions of lives were lost to preventable illnesses. The delay in public awareness and regulatory action allowed the industry to continue profiting while the costs were borne by individuals and the healthcare system. The success of the tobacco industry's doubt-mongering not only prolonged the smoking epidemic but also set a dangerous precedent. Its strategies would be adopted by other industries seeking to protect their interests, from fossil fuels to pesticides. The tobacco industry demonstrated that with enough money, strategic communication, and manipulation of science, it was possible to sow confusion and evade accountability on a global scale. A turning point. Public health advocates eventually broke through the fog of doubt. Landmark studies, such as the 1964 U.S. Surgeon General's report, unequivocally linked smoking to lung cancer, heart disease, and other illnesses. Public health campaigns and litigation forced the industry to confront its deception, leading to tighter regulations, warning labels, and advertising bans. Yet, the damage was already done. As we move forward in this book, we will see how the methods pioneered by the tobacco industry were repurposed to obscure the risks of secondhand smoke, environmental crises, and climate change. The seeds of doubt planted in the mid-20th century would grow into a pervasive and persistent challenge to scientific integrity and public trust. Chapter 3. The Smoke Around Secondhand Harm. Having sown doubt about the dangers of active smoking, the tobacco industry turned its attention to a new frontier: secondhand smoke. Known as environmental tobacco smoke, ETS, secondhand smoke posed a significant public health threat, as research began to reveal in the late 20th century. Unlike the active smoker, who consciously assumes the risks, non-smokers exposed to ETS faced involuntary harm. This raised profound ethical and regulatory questions, ones the tobacco industry sought to cloud with its established arsenal of doubt-mongering tactics. Discovery of secondhand smoke's dangers. The story of secondhand smoke began within the tobacco industry itself. In the 1970s, internal studies conducted by tobacco company scientists uncovered alarming findings. Secondhand smoke was not only harmful but potentially more toxic than active smoking. This was due to the way smoldering cigarettes burned at lower temperatures, producing higher concentrations of carcinogens and other toxic compounds. Public awareness of these risks grew in the 1980s as independent researchers published studies linking secondhand smoke to lung cancer, heart disease, and respiratory issues. By the early 1990s, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, classified ETS as a Group A carcinogen, an agent known to cause cancer in humans. This classification added urgency to efforts to protect non-smokers through public health measures such as workplace smoking bans and restrictions in public spaces. The industry's response, doubt-mongering 2.0. The tobacco industry recognized that secondhand smoke posed a unique challenge to its business model. Unlike active smoking, where personal choice could be emphasized, secondhand smoke exposed non-smokers, including children, to harm. To counter this growing threat to its public image and bottom line, the industry launched a well-funded campaign to discredit the science and stall regulation. Key strategies to undermine the science. 1. Challenging the EPA. The industry's primary target was the EPA, which had become a central authority in publicizing the dangers of secondhand smoke. Industry-backed scientists accused the EPA of conducting junk science, alleging bias and procedural flaws in its risk assessments. This was a calculated attack designed to erode public confidence in the agency's findings. 2. Funding counter-research. The tobacco industry funded studies designed to cast doubt on the link between ETS and health risks. These studies often use flawed methodologies or selectively presented data, creating an illusion of scientific uncertainty. For instance, some reports argued that indoor air pollution from other sources, such as cooking or heating, was a greater threat than secondhand smoke. 3. Framing as overreach. The industry framed smoking bans as an infringement on personal freedoms and a slippery slope toward government overreach. By shifting the focus from public health to individual rights, the industry sought to galvanize opposition to smoking restrictions. 4. AstroTurf advocacy. The industry created or supported grassroots organizations that appeared to represent ordinary citizens but were, in fact, fronts for tobacco interests. These groups lobbied against smoking bans, claiming they would harm businesses like bars and restaurants. The role of Fred Singer. A pivotal figure in this campaign was Fred Singer, a physicist known for his work in atmospheric sciences but with no expertise in public health. Singer became a vocal critic of the EPA, accusing the agency of exaggerating risk to justify its regulatory agenda. His stature as a scientist lent credibility to the industry's claims, even as his arguments were widely criticized by independent experts. Singer's involvement highlighted a recurring pattern. Merchants of doubt often leveraged the reputations of scientists from unrelated fields to challenge established evidence. This tactic created the illusion of credible dissent, even when the dissent lacked substantive grounding in the relevant science. The impact of doubt on policy and public perception. The tobacco industry's campaigns succeeded in delaying widespread regulation of secondhand smoke. For years, public understanding of ETS was clouded by misinformation, and policymakers hesitated to implement smoking bans. This delay had tangible consequences. Countless non-smokers continued to suffer avoidable health problems, and healthcare costs associated with tobacco-related illnesses escalated. Despite these setbacks, the tide eventually turned. Groundbreaking lawsuits in the 1990s exposed the tobacco industry's internal documents, revealing the extent of its deception. Public health advocacy and mounting evidence from independent research forced governments worldwide to take action. By the early 21st century, smoking bans had become standard in many countries, significantly reducing exposure to secondhand smoke and improving public health outcomes. Lessons learned. The fight over secondhand smoke offers crucial insights into the tactics and impacts of doubt-mongering. It underscores the importance of transparency in scientific research, the need for independent funding of public health studies, and the role of robust regulatory frameworks in countering corporate disinformation. As we move into the next chapters, we will see how these same strategies were repurposed to undermine scientific findings on environmental and national security issues. The tobacco industry may have pioneered doubt-mongering, but its lessons were not lost on other industries and interest groups seeking to evade accountability. Chapter 4: Star Wars and Nuclear Winter, Doubt in National Defense. As the merchants of doubt moved beyond the realm of public health, they turned their sights on national security, where the stakes were no less existential. The United States strategic defense initiatives during the Cold War, most notably the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, commonly known as Star Wars, offered fertile ground for doubt-mongering. While proponents of SDI promised an impenetrable shield against nuclear missiles, Critics argued that such claims ignored scientific limitations and the potential for catastrophic consequences, including nuclear winter. This chapter examines how doubt was used both to promote and to undermine national defense strategies, illustrating the complex interplay between science, politics, and public perception. Strategic defense: the promise of a missile shield. In the early 1980s, President Ronald Reagan unveiled SDI, an ambitious plan to develop a space-based missile defense system capable of intercepting incoming nuclear warheads. The vision was rooted in advanced technologies such as laser weapons and satellite-based interceptors, offering the promise of rendering nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete. For a public weary of Cold War tensions, the concept was appealing, a technological miracle that could ensure safety without the moral and strategic dilemmas of mutual assured destruction, MAD. However, scientific experts were quick to point out the limitations of SDI. Intercepting a missile in flight, especially in its high-speed mid-course phase, posed enormous technical challenges. Moreover, critics argued that even a partially effective system could destabilize the delicate balance of power, potentially provoking an arms race as adversaries developed countermeasures. Despite these concerns, proponents of SDI dismissed skepticism as defeatism, framing critics as unpatriotic or lacking vision. Manufacturing certainty in an uncertain science. The SDI debate exemplified how doubt could be used both offensively and defensively. Proponents of SDI, supported by government officials and defense contractors, downplayed scientific criticisms and exaggerated the feasibility of the proposed technologies. To this end, they funded studies and public relations campaigns that presented SDI as not only achievable but inevitable. Critics, on the other hand, pointed to the inherent uncertainty in the science underpinning SDI. They highlighted the system's reliance on unproven technologies and questioned the ethical implications of pursuing such a project. For the merchants of doubt, this debate was an opportunity to manipulate perceptions of science itself, positioning optimism as a virtue and skepticism as an obstacle to progress. The shadow of nuclear winter. As the SDI debate raged on, another scientific concern emerged: the possibility of nuclear winter. In the mid-1980s, researchers using advanced climate models warned that even a limited nuclear exchange could release massive amounts of soot and debris into the atmosphere, blocking sunlight and causing global temperatures to plummet. This nuclear winter scenario threatened to render the planet uninhabitable, regardless of who won the conflict. The concept of nuclear winter posed a direct challenge to the logic of SDI. If the consequences of nuclear war extended far beyond the immediate blast zones, the utility of missile defense systems became questionable. Critics argued that focusing on SDI distracted from the broader goal of nuclear disarmament, which was the only true safeguard against such apocalyptic outcomes. The role of merchants of doubt. Doubt-mongers played a pivotal role in shaping public and political perceptions of nuclear winter. Conservative think tanks and defense analysts aligned with SDI proponents sought to discredit the science behind nuclear winter, labeling it speculative and alarmist. They emphasized uncertainties in the climate models and accused researchers of political bias, arguing that the concept was being used to undermine U.S. defense policy. At the same time, other merchants of doubt exploited public fears of nuclear winter to advocate for SDI, framing it as a moral imperative. By presenting SDI as the only viable solution to prevent nuclear catastrophe, they sidestepped the broader implications of nuclear winter and deflected calls for disarmament. Consequences of the debate. The intersection of SDI and nuclear winter highlighted a troubling reality: scientific evidence could be both weaponized and dismissed depending on the agenda it served. While the SDI program ultimately fell short of its lofty promises, its legacy endured in the form of continued investment in missile defense technologies. The nuclear winter debate, meanwhile, faded from public consciousness, overshadowed by the end of the Cold War and the perception that the threat of nuclear conflict had diminished. Lessons for today. The SDI and nuclear winter controversies reveal the profound impact of doubt-mongering on national security discourse. By amplifying uncertainties and framing dissent as unpatriotic, merchants of doubt can shape public opinion and policy in ways that prioritize short-term interests over long-term consequences. As we move forward, we will see how similar tactics have been employed to obscure the realities of environmental crises, from acid rain to climate change. The story of SDI and nuclear winter serves as a cautionary tale, reminding us that science, when wielded responsibly, can illuminate paths to safety, but when distorted, it can lead us astray. Chapter 5: Environmental Crises: From Acid Rain to the Ozone Hole. As the merchants of doubt expanded their influence, the environment became a prime target for their campaigns. Unlike national security or public health, environmental issues often expose deep-seated failures of unregulated markets. Problems like acid rain and the depletion of the ozone layer revealed how industrial activities could inflict widespread harm that the free market was ill-equipped to address. In this chapter, we examine how doubt-mongering delayed meaningful action on these environmental crises and the lessons learned from these battles. Acid rain, a manufactured controversy. Acid rain, caused by the release of sulfur dioxide, SO2, and nitrogen oxides, NOx, into the atmosphere, became a major environmental concern in the 1970s and 1980s. These pollutants, primarily emitted by coal-fired power plants and vehicles, reacted with water vapor to form acidic compounds, which then fell to the ground as rain. Acid rain devastated forests, poisoned freshwater ecosystems, and eroded buildings and monuments. Scientific studies, including the landmark 1984 National Acid Precipitation Assessment Program, NAPAP, provided overwhelming evidence of acid rain's environmental damage and identified the burning of fossil fuels as the primary culprit. These findings prompted calls for government regulation, such as implementing cap-and-trade programs to limit SO2 emissions. The merchants of doubt enter the scene. Industrial groups, particularly in the coal and energy sectors, resisted these regulatory efforts. To protect their interests, they turned to doubt-mongering strategies. 1. Questioning the science. Industry-backed scientists claimed that acid rain's effects were exaggerated or that its causes were unclear. They argued that natural processes, such as volcanic eruptions, could be contributing factors, diverting attention from anthropogenic emissions. 2. Highlighting uncertainty. Merchants of doubt emphasized gaps in the research, such as variability in acid rain's impact across regions, to suggest that more studies were needed before taking regulatory action. 3. Framing as an economic threat. Industry representatives warned that regulations to curb SO2 emissions would lead to skyrocketing energy costs, job losses, and economic stagnation. By framing the issue in terms of economic hardship, they sought to shift public opinion against intervention. Breaking through the fog. Despite these efforts, the scientific consensus prevailed, leading to significant policy changes. The U.S. Clean Air Act amendments of 1990 established a cap-and-trade program for SO2 emissions, which successfully reduced acid rain and demonstrated the effectiveness of market-based environmental solutions. The acid rain debate revealed that even well-funded campaigns of doubt could be overcome by persistent advocacy, transparent science, and innovative policymaking. The ozone hole, a rare victory for science. While the acid rain debate was protracted, the discovery of the ozone hole over Antarctica in the 1980s elicited a much swifter response. The ozone layer, which shields the Earth from harmful ultraviolet UV radiation, was being depleted by chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, chemicals widely used in refrigeration, air conditioning, and aerosol products. The discovery of the ozone hole by British scientists in 1985 shocked the world. Subsequent research confirmed that CFCs, once released into the atmosphere, broke down ozone molecules through chemical reactions catalyzed by sunlight. Increased UV radiation due to ozone depletion posed severe risks, including higher rates of skin cancer, cataracts, and harm to ecosystems. The role of doubtmongers. Despite the compelling evidence, CFC manufacturers initially resisted regulation. Merchants of doubt employed familiar tactics, including questioning the validity of the data, downplaying the risks, and emphasizing the economic costs of phasing out CFCs. They argued that restrictions on CFCs would cripple industries and disrupt everyday life. However, the rapid and undeniable deterioration of the ozone layer made these arguments less effective. The visual evidence of the ozone hole, captured in satellite imagery, galvanized public and political support for action. The urgency of the problem left little room for manufactured uncertainty to take hold. The Montreal Protocol, a model for action. In 1987, the international community adopted the Montreal Protocol, a landmark treaty aimed at phasing out CFCs and other ozone-depleting substances. The protocol was notable for its bipartisan support, flexible implementation mechanisms, and ability to adapt as new scientific knowledge emerged. Over time, it became one of the most successful environmental agreements in history, with measurable improvements in ozone recovery. Lessons from two crises. The contrasting outcomes of the acid rain and ozone debates underscore the power of evidence-based action and the perils of delay. While doubtmongers succeeded in stalling regulation on acid rain, they were unable to prevent decisive action on the ozone layer. Several factors contributed to this difference. 1. Public perception. The ozone hole was a dramatic and tangible problem that resonated with the public, making it harder for merchants of doubt to obscure the issue. 2. Global collaboration. The international nature of the ozone crisis fostered cooperation rather than conflict, demonstrating the potential for unified action in addressing environmental challenges. 3. Policy innovation. The Montreal Protocol provided a blueprint for balancing economic and environmental concerns, showing that regulation could drive technological innovation and long-term sustainability. The acid rain and ozone layer debates illustrate how environmental issues challenge both markets and ideologies. Merchants of doubt continue to exploit uncertainty to resist change, but the victories achieved in these cases remind us that science, when paired with effective advocacy and policymaking, can overcome even the most entrenched opposition. In the next chapter, we will turn to the modern-day battleground of climate change, a crisis that brings together the strategies, stakes, and players from all the previous chapters. The lessons of acid rain and the ozone layer will serve as critical touchstones for understanding this global challenge. Chapter 6: Climate Change, the Ultimate Test of Doubt. Among all the battles waged by the merchants of doubt, climate change represents the most consequential and enduring. Unlike other issues, where the consequences of inaction unfolded over decades, climate change presents a planetary-scale crisis with irreversible implications. It is the perfect storm for doubt-mongering, an issue rooted in complex science, steeped in uncertainty, and entwined with the very foundations of modern society, energy consumption and economic growth. This chapter examines how doubt has been manufactured around climate science and the far-reaching consequences of this campaign. The discovery of climate change. Scientific inquiry into climate change dates back over a century. In the mid-19th century, John Tyndall identified the heat-trapping properties of carbon dioxide, CO2, and other greenhouse gases. In the early 20th century, Svante Arrhenius proposed that burning fossil fuels could increase atmospheric CO2 levels, raising global temperatures. By the 1950s, Charles David Keeling's meticulous measurements revealed a steady rise in CO2 concentrations, a trend that became known as the Keeling curve. By the late 20th century, the evidence was overwhelming. Climate models predicted rising global temperatures, melting polar ice, rising sea levels, and more frequent extreme weather events. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, established in 1988, synthesized these findings, concluding that human activities, primarily the burning of fossil fuels, were the dominant cause of global warming. Enter the merchants of doubt. The fossil fuel industry, faced with the existential threat of regulation, launched a doubt-mongering campaign of unprecedented scale. Borrowing tactics from the tobacco industry, the merchants of doubt sought to discredit climate science, delay policy action, and protect their profits. Their strategies included: 1. Questioning the consensus. Climate change deniers argued that the science was unsettled, pointing to natural climate variability as a potential explanation for observed changes. They highlighted minor disagreements among scientists to suggest a lack of consensus, despite overwhelming agreement within the scientific community. 2. Funding counter-research. Fossil fuel companies, particularly ExxonMobil and Koch Industries, funded think tanks, researchers, and advocacy groups to produce studies casting doubt on human-induced climate change. These studies were often methodologically flawed but widely publicized, creating an illusion of credible dissent. 3. Attacking climate models. Merchants of doubt criticized climate models as unreliable, emphasizing the inherent uncertainty in long-term projections. They argued that because models could not predict future conditions with absolute precision, they should not be used to inform policy. 4. Shaping public opinion. Through advertising, media campaigns, and public relations efforts, the fossil fuel industry framed climate change as a hoax or exaggerated threat. They appealed to economic fears, claiming that policies to reduce emissions would destroy jobs, raise energy costs, and harm the economy. Exploiting political divisions. Climate change became a deeply politicized issue, particularly in the United States. Conservative politicians and think tanks, ideologically aligned with free market principles, amplified the fossil fuel industry's messaging. They framed climate policies as a gateway to government overreach, portraying environmentalists as anti-growth radicals. This polarization was further fueled by media coverage that emphasized balance, giving equal weight to climate skeptics and climate scientists. This false equivalence created the impression of a divided scientific community, even as the vast majority of researchers agreed on the reality of anthropogenic climate change. The costs of delay. The doubt-mongering campaign has had profound consequences. Decades of inaction have allowed greenhouse gas emissions to continue rising, pushing the planet toward critical tipping points. The impacts of climate change, extreme heat waves, devastating hurricanes, prolonged droughts, and rising sea levels are already being felt, particularly in vulnerable communities. Economic costs are mounting as well. Damage from climate-related disasters runs into hundreds of billions of dollars annually, while the transition to renewable energy becomes more challenging and expensive the longer it is delayed. The human toll, from displacement to food and water insecurity, underscores the moral imperative of addressing climate change. Countering the merchants of doubt. Despite the challenges, progress has been made. Public awareness of climate change has grown, driven by visible impacts, activism, and influential reports such as the IPCC's assessments. Renewable energy technologies have advanced rapidly, becoming more affordable and accessible. International agreements like the Paris Accord have established a framework for global cooperation, though their implementation remains uneven. Scientists and advocates have also learned to counter doubt-mongering more effectively. They emphasize the overwhelming consensus on climate change, communicate its risks in relatable terms, and highlight the economic and social benefits of transitioning to a low-carbon future. Transparency and accountability have become central to these efforts, exposing the fossil fuel industry's role in spreading misinformation. The battle ahead. The fight against climate change is far from over. The merchants of doubt continue to adapt their strategies, shifting from outright denial to more subtle forms of obstructionism. They now emphasize technological fixes like carbon capture or geoengineering to delay emissions reductions, or they argue that adaptation is more feasible than mitigation. However, the lessons of past battles, from tobacco to acid rain, offer hope. They show that persistent advocacy, clear communication, and evidence-based policymaking can overcome even the most entrenched resistance. Conclusion: a turning point for humanity. Climate change represents the ultimate test for science, society, and governance. The stakes are unprecedented, but so are the opportunities for innovation and collaboration. The merchants of doubt may have delayed action, but they cannot prevent the inevitable shift toward a more sustainable and equitable world, if we have the collective will to act. As this book concludes, it leaves readers with a question: what role will you play in this critical moment? Will you allow doubt to paralyze progress, or will you join the growing movement to confront the defining challenge of our time? Conclusion: confronting doubt in the age of consequences. The story of the merchants of doubt is not merely a historical narrative, but a stark reminder of the ongoing battle between truth and manipulation. From tobacco smoke to climate change, these campaigns reveal a troubling pattern: vested interests exploiting public misunderstandings of science to sow confusion, delay action, and safeguard profits. The consequences, whether measured in lives lost, ecosystems destroyed, or opportunities squandered, underscore the high stakes of this battle. The enduring legacy of doubt. Doubt-mongering thrives on the complexities of science, turning its inherent uncertainties into tools for obstruction. By reframing questions as controversies and evidence as opinion, merchants of doubt undermine public trust in institutions and erode the foundation for collective action. This strategy, perfected by the tobacco industry and later adopted by others, has proven alarmingly effective in slowing progress on critical issues. Yet, as we have seen in the case studies throughout this book, doubt-mongering is not invincible. Tobacco regulation eventually triumphed, public awareness of secondhand smoke grew, and acid rain was mitigated through innovative policies. Even the ozone hole, a dire environmental crisis, galvanized swift international cooperation, proving that science can overcome disinformation when paired with decisive action. These victories remind us that while doubt may delay progress, it cannot indefinitely forestall the truth. The challenge of climate change. Climate change, however, presents a challenge unlike any other. Its global scale, systemic nature, and deeply entrenched economic interests make it a formidable battleground for doubt-mongers. Addressing climate change requires not only technological innovation, but also profound shifts in policy, behavior, and global cooperation. The merchants of doubt understand this, and they are adapting their strategies to prolong the status quo. But the lessons of history offer hope. The growing visibility of climate impacts, combined with the rise of renewable energy and grassroots activism, has created momentum for change. Transparency, accountability, and a commitment to evidence-based decision-making are powerful tools in countering disinformation. The climate battle is winnable, but only if we act with urgency and resolve. How to combat doubt? In this age of abundant information and rampant misinformation, it is more important than ever to develop the skills to discern fact from fiction. Here are some practical steps for countering doubt-mongering. 1. Understand the science. Familiarize yourself with the basics of the scientific process and its methodologies. Recognize that uncertainty is a natural part of science, not a reason to dismiss its findings. 2. Evaluate sources. Be critical of where information comes from. Who funds the research? What are the credentials and potential biases of the authors? Transparency about motives and affiliations is crucial. 3. Follow the consensus. Pay attention to the scientific consensus on major issues. While individual studies may diverge, the collective agreement of experts in the field provides a reliable guide to the state of knowledge. 4. Advocate for policy. Support evidence-based policies and hold leaders accountable for inaction or disinformation. Public pressure has been instrumental in overcoming doubt-mongering in the past and will remain vital in the future. 5. Engage in dialogue. Educate others and challenge misinformation when you encounter it. Conversations, whether online or in person, can be powerful tools for spreading awareness and countering doubt. A call to action. The merchants of doubt are not omnipotent. Their success depends on public passivity, political inaction, and the perpetuation of misinformation. To counter their influence, we must become active participants in the fight for truth. This means holding ourselves and others accountable, advocating for transparency, and championing the values of science and integrity. As you close this book, consider its lessons not as a retrospective on past battles but as a guide for navigating the challenges ahead. The fight against doubt is, at its core, a fight for the future, one in which the choices we make today will shape the world for generations to come. Will we allow doubt to dictate the narrative, or will we reclaim the power of truth and science? The answer lies with each of us.